Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi Christian University. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights, and each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. First up on our list of historical highlights for the week, and the subject of our deep dive, is Quaker teacher and abolitionist Anthony Benezet. On June 28, 1770, Benezet opened a school in Philadelphia specifically for black children, both free and enslaved. He taught classes himself, purchased supplies with his own money, and devoted countless hours to the education of children whom society had largely neglected. Education, however, was only one part of Benezet's broader mission. Through his writings, correspondence, and advocacy, he condemned the transatlantic slave trade and argued that the full humanity of slaves should be recognized. His 1771 work, Some Historical Account of Guinea, circulated widely and influenced later abolitionists on both sides of the Atlantic. Leaders such as John Wesley and Thomas Clarkson would draw upon Benezet's arguments in the fight against slavery. Next up on our list is the famed Apache leader, Geronimo. After his family was killed in an attack by Mexican soldiers, Geronimo spent much of his life resisting Mexican and later American military campaigns. His daring raids and remarkable ability to evade capture made him one of the most recognizable figures of the American West. After surrendering in 1886, however, he spent the remainder of his life as a prisoner of war in the Oklahoma Territory. During those years of captivity, Geronimo came into regular contact with Christian missionaries, and their influence eventually led him to profess faith in Christ. On July 1, 1903, he was baptized into the Methodist Church at Medicine Creek, Oklahoma Territory. In his autobiography, Geronimo explained that he believed Christianity helped him become a better man, writing, quote, "I have adopted the Christian religion. I am not ashamed to be a Christian," end quote. He later drifted away from the church before seeking reconciliation. Though his spiritual journey was uneven, it reflected a sincere struggle to reconcile a violent past with a new faith. Last up on our list of historical highlights for the week is the second edition of the Complete Bible in the Algonquian language. Printed in Boston on July 2, 1752, this edition followed the original 1663 printing, which had become scarce after decades of use. Puritan missionary John Eliot, often remembered as the Apostle to the Indians, spent years learning the Algonquian dialect spoken by many native peoples of southern New England, convinced that genuine Christian discipleship required people to hear and read God's word in their own language. Eliot's translation demanded painstaking linguistic work, as no written form of the language existed. An alphabet, grammar, and vocabulary had to be created before translation could even begin. Ironically, it remained less expensive to import English Bibles from England than to print them in the American colonies. Thus, the first Bible printed in what is now the United States was not in English at all. It was produced specifically for Native American readers. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Brycchan Carey of Northumbria University about Anthony Benezet.
Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are always excited to learn new things about different people or different events or things that have shaped the greater, bigger part of events within Christian history. And today is yet another great example. And we're going to learn more about Anthony Benezet, who was a eventual Quaker, started out as a Huguenot who put a lot of energy and effort into free education and schools for African-American children in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And one of the people we are pleased and proud to have as our guest today is Professor Brycchan Carey, who is a professor of many parts of humanities and others at Northumbria University in the northern part of England and the UK. So, Professor, thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Absolutely. Well, tell us a little bit. We're using the date of one of his publications, which I think was I don't remember the exact title, but it's around reflections on things that happened in Guinea, maybe, or New Guinea or something, which was June 28th, 1770 is what we have down. So that's why we're using that as our date to be able to talk about him. But give us some background on who Anthony was and why you think we would be talking about him on a podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, first of all, just start with the name,
Sure.
Anthony Benezet, because he's often mispronounced, and he was actually in his later life he would have said his name very differently to the name he was born with. He was born in northern France, in a place called Saint-Quentin in northern France, and he was born as Antoine Benezet.
Hmm.
And his family were Huguenot, that is to say, they were French Protestants. And the family fled quite early in at that point Antoine's life. They fled across the border into the Netherlands. They settled in Rotterdam
Hmm.
for a little while, and then they moved to London. And they joined what was quite a large community of Huguenots in London in the early 18th century, sort of French Protestant refugees. And while they were there, the Benezet family first of all, they converted to Quakerism. They also
Hmm.
started pronouncing their names in a more English fashion. So Benezet became Benezet. And we know that he pronounced the T at the end of his name in later life because sometimes he spells his name with two T's, a very emphatic two T's to show us that we have to pronounce the T. Um, and we think he was probably Anthony. He was born Antoine, so the hard T is in there. So he was probably Anthony rather than Anthony. Antoine Benezet, born in France, became Anthony Benezet in London. And they, as I said, they converted to Quakerism and moved to the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania in around 1730.
Okay.
So this was at a point when Pennsylvania was becoming more established, and when its principal city, which had only a couple of decades before been little more than a village, really, but by this time was
Hmm.
turning into what we would now think of today as quite a substantial town, even a small city. So they were moving into, in fact, it became the biggest city in the British American colonies at that time, and so he moves to this Quaker colony with his parents at the age of 18. And you can just
Okay.
imagine what it must have been like for a sort of a child who'd started in France, spent time in the Netherlands, grown up probably mostly in London, to be translated again or transported again across the Atlantic this time, a voyage which would have taken several months to the city of Philadelphia, where they found themselves surrounded by people of their faith, their newly adopted faith of Quakerism. And that's where Benezet would remain for the rest of his life.
Well, what was his father's profession? Did they have particular that they were just trying to there for religious freedom? I mean, Quakers being persecuted in England at the time would have been a pretty hefty thing, right? And so getting out of there, number one, was probably a motivation. But did he also have a particular vocation, profession, or something that his father or his family did to earn a living?
Yeah, putting me on the spot a little here, but
Oh,
his
I'm
father was
sorry.
in
Okay.
trade. He was a tradesman, and
Okay.
they were from a kind of what we would today call a middle class family, a sort of
Okay.
middling sort of traders, and so on. He had a business, and we know that they sort of involved in various forms of trade. For example, we do know that his father, that's Jean-Étienne de Benezet, represented the great French polymath writer Voltaire,
Oh, really?
represented his interests in London. So he was
Huh.
involved in that sort of business, sort of dealings between the French and the English in London at that point. And when they moved to Philadelphia, they carried on in business. And Anthony initially set up in business himself, but it turned out
Oh,
he wasn't very good at it. He wasn't a natural businessman. He was not very good at the wheeling and dealing and so on. And so instead, he gravitated more towards education, and
Mhm.
his career for at the time people would have thought of him as a school teacher primarily.
How about that? And so, how then does he kind of transform, if you will, or move into the thought processes of abolitionism and really this idea that, as I understand it, and which is kind of a Quaker equalitarian idea as well. Hey, everybody, women, people who, no matter what your skin tone is or where you come from, you should be able to have the opportunity for an education. I mean, that's somewhere. Did he have any kind of like an epiphany moment that this just kind of came to him, or did this happen over time that he really wanted to put his energy and effort into that?
It's an interesting question. If he did have a moment of epiphany, I don't know what it was,
Okay.
and it's not recorded. It does more look like a gradual process, actually.
Mm,
I think also we should just say that the Quakers, um, the way that you characterize them as sort of looking for the equality of all people, uh, isn't necessarily something they set out with. This was a
mm,
developing conversation amongst Quakers,
okay.
and it took Quakers a very long time to, for example, come from the sort of first stirrings of anti-slavery to what we would now think of as abolitionism,
Ah,
because abolitionism is really a kind of active stance against slavery, against the slave trade, where you're actually saying, let's get rid of it, let's abolish this. Anti-slavery is a bit more diffuse. It's lots of people can be against slavery or against
right.
the enslaving other people without necessarily taking an active stance about it. But when Benezet got to Philadelphia in the 1730s, there had actually been a conversation going on amongst Quakers, perhaps not other people, but Quakers certainly, about whether it was right or wrong to make slaves of others. In fact, there'd been some conversation about this amongst Quakers in Barbados as
Hmm.
long back as the sort of 1670s, 1680s. That conversation had been picked up in Philadelphia right at the end of the 17th and at the beginning of the 18th century, and it kind of came and went and so on. When Benezet arrived in Philadelphia, there were a couple of Quakers, Ralph or Rafe Sanderford. I'm not sure whether it's Ralph or Rafe, but Sanderford and Benjamin Lay, who are now quite well known, but they were probably a little bit marginal at the time. That they were making a kind of very a visible anti-slavery protest. Benjamin Lay, for example, he's quite well known in Philadelphia and in anti-slavery circles for his kind of anti-slavery stunts. Quite famously, he once sort of hollowed out a Bible, filled it with pokeberry juice, which looks a bit like blood, and he took his sword and he thrust it through this Bible, splattering the Quaker meeting with what they thought for a moment was blood, just to say that, he was saying, but by enslaving others, you are
Ah,
murdering the word of God, was his view.
wow.
Now, these didn't necessarily change people's minds in Quaker communities in the 1730s, but they did mean that people were talking about slavery in a way that others in other communities across the English-speaking world weren't so much. And so for this young man who's just arrived from London, he's
Mhm.
in Philadelphia for the first time, he's exposed to new ideas. It must have been something that he became aware of and was inspired by, or at least that piqued his interest. So what we find is that for the next sort of 2 or 3 decades, he's becoming more and more well, he's mostly an educationalist, but he's more and more interested in the situation of enslaved people in Philadelphia. So he's teaching in the English school in Philadelphia, and it's by the 1750s. So we're now talking 20 years. He's now in since he arrived. He's now in his late 30s, maybe early
Mhm.
40s. He starts opening up the school, or at least opening up opportunities for learning to people of color, to enslave people in Philadelphia at that time. And this is a kind of a quite a revolutionary thing here. So he's what he's trying to do is extend opportunity as far as is possible in a slave-owning society. He's trying to extend opportunities for learning to everybody, whether free or enslaved, whether white or black. And I think that process of opening up education is also a process in which he becomes to more and more deeply feel, as he would call it, the iniquity of slavery, a phrase that he uses. And so I think, to get back to a question about epiphany, I don't know that there was any epiphany moment, but we can see in his career as an educationalist this kind of growing desire to, first of all, to help enslaved people, and then to free them.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Brycchan Carey by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi Christian University in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.